It started as an ordinary night, quiet and uneventful. My husband and I had gone to bed like usual, expecting nothing out of the ordinary. But just before midnight, he woke me up, his voice low and serious. He said someone had been knocking on our door and ringing the bell over and over again. For 10 whole minutes, the sound had echoed through the apartment, breaking the silence of the night. At first, I thought it might just be a mistake, maybe someone looking for the wrong apartment. But my husband's expression told me otherwise. He looked uneasy, and that's what scared me. He needed me to check, to see if I recognized the person outside. Reluctantly, I got up and made my way to the window, my stomach twisting with unease. When I looked outside, I didn't see a random passerby or a lost visitor. I saw someone deliberate, someone who didn't belong there. And that's when my fear began to grow. The man I saw outside wasn't trying to hide. He stood there in plain view, casually walking back to his car in the parking lot. He was wearing blue jeans and a grey t-shirt, nothing unusual, but something about him felt wrong. He looked like he might be in his early 30s, with blonde hair and a medium build. What caught my attention the most was what he had in his hand. It looked like resistance bands or maybe rope. Why would someone carry something like that so late at night? My instincts told me it wasn't good. He didn't look panicked or lost, he looked calm, like he had a purpose. I kept watching him as he sat in his car. He didn't drive away. Instead, he stayed there, sitting still, as if he was waiting for something or someone. That's when I knew this wasn't just a random visitor. It felt like he was watching us, waiting for the right moment to act. As I stayed by the window, I called dispatch and explained what was happening. The operator assured me that the police were on their way, and I felt a small sense of relief. While on the phone, I decided to record everything. I read out the license plate, make, and model of his car, making sure I captured every detail. I couldn't risk forgetting anything if it came to that. But just as I thought he might stay in his car, he suddenly stepped out and walked back toward our door. This time, his knocks were louder, more forceful. My heart raced as I stayed on the line, praying the police would get there in time. It wasn't just our door he had targeted. I learned later that my downstairs neighbor had seen him too, and what she told me only made things worse. After the man finally left, my downstairs neighbor came knocking on my door. She looked shaken, her voice trembling as she spoke. She told me the man had been peering into her children's windows earlier. He didn't just knock on her door, he pounded on it. What terrified her the most was that her husband had left the house just a minute before it started. She believed the man saw her kids through the window, and that's why he kept knocking. Her words sent a chill down my spine. Our apartment doors are close to each other, so it seemed like he didn't know which one he wanted to get into. And then she told me something that made my stomach drop. She had seen him looking up at our windows too. It wasn't just her family he was watching. He was watching us as well. After hearing my neighbor's story, I knew we had to take immediate action to protect ourselves. I turned off all the lights in the apartment and shut the blinds, trying to make it harder for him to see inside. My husband and I decided to stay quiet and keep an eye out while I waited for the police to arrive. We started thinking about how vulnerable we were. Our locks, windows, and doors suddenly felt like they weren't enough. I told my neighbor we needed to make changes, and we both agreed. I decided to replace our porch lights with motion detectors and add security bars to the windows and door tracks. It was clear this wasn't just a random visit. This man had a plan, and we had to be ready for whatever might happen next. As I sat replaying the night in my head, another memory surfaced, one that made everything feel even more unsettling. About a week earlier, I had taken my dog out for a walk around 8 p.m. While we were in the parking lot, I noticed a car driving unusually slow. It parked a few spots away from where I stood, but the engine stayed on. The person inside never got out. I remember feeling an overwhelming sense of unease. My ears started ringing, and a heavy feeling of dread settled over me. I didn't let my dog finish his walk. I turned around and rushed home, locking every door and window behind me. Looking back now, I'm convinced it was the same car. That man had been watching us for days, maybe even planning something. It wasn't just a coincidence. It felt like we had been chosen. When the police finally arrived, I expected them to take the situation seriously. They pulled the man over and questioned him briefly. But instead of digging deeper, they let him go. His excuse: he said he was meeting an acquaintance. That was it. No further questions, no investigation, nothing. I couldn't believe it. When I followed up with the police later, they told me there wasn't even a case, just a documented contact. My frustration turned to anger. This wasn't just a misunderstanding or a harmless encounter. Everything about his behavior pointed to something more sinister, but it seemed like no one else was taking it seriously. I felt helpless, knowing the man had been let go without any real answers. After realizing the police weren't going to do much, I knew we had to take control of the situation. My husband and I decided to take extra precautions to keep ourselves safe. We made plans to buy a firearm, something we'd never considered before. I already had experience with firearms, but my husband didn't, so he planned to take a safety class. I also made the decision to file a suspicious person report, even if the police didn't think it was necessary. I wanted a paper trail, something to protect us if this man came back. Every time I thought about the events of that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. He had been watching us, and I had no doubt he'd do it again. All we could do was stay prepared and stay vigilant. Nantes is a peaceful city, a place where I've always felt safe walking alone. I've lived here for years, and I know the streets well. I've always trusted my instincts and avoided danger. It's something I've learned to rely on, a feeling that's kept me safe in the past. But nothing about that evening gave me any warning. It felt like just another normal day. Visiting my friend was meant to be a small act of kindness. She needed support, and I was happy to be there for her. The time slipped away quickly as we talked and laughed, and before I knew it, night had fallen. Despite the late hour, I felt no fear. This was my city, my home. I had walked this route many times before, and I didn't think twice about doing it again. The streets were quieter than usual as I started my walk home. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that the silence was normal for this time of night. The air was cool, and the distant sound of the river felt calming at first. But the further I walked, the heavier the air seemed to get, like the night itself was pressing down on me. As I approached the bridge, I couldn't shake the strange feeling in my chest. It was as if something unseen was watching me. I glanced around, but the streets were empty. I told myself it was just my imagination, maybe the result of being out alone so late. Still, I kept walking, forcing myself to act normal, even though every step felt harder than the last. They came closer, and I felt my pulse quicken. The three men were tall, much taller than me, and their presence felt overwhelming. They didn't seem drunk or lost, they looked focused, like they had a purpose. They spoke to each other in a language I didn't understand, their voices low but filled with something I couldn't place. I kept walking, trying not to show any fear. I didn't want to draw their attention, but it was too late. They noticed me. Their steps slowed as they got closer, and then they stopped. I could feel their eyes on me, watching every move I made. My instinct screamed at me to run, but I knew that showing fear would only make things worse. As they closed in around me, their behavior became strange and unsettling. They leaned in closer, whispering things I couldn't understand. Their words were foreign, but their tone was mocking, filled with a cruel amusement. Then they started making noises, animal noises. They howled, growled, and even whistled, all while laughing at my obvious discomfort. They were inches from my face, invading my space, their voices growing louder. I kept walking, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other, but the fear was suffocating. The bridge felt endless, and every step made me feel more trapped. My hands were shaking, and my heart was racing, but I didn't dare stop. I could feel their breath on my skin as they taunted me. The voice startled me, and for a moment, everything stopped. I turned toward the sound and saw a tall man walking toward us. His expression was serious, and his voice was steady as he called my name again. I didn't recognize him, but in that moment, he felt like my only hope. He approached us with confidence, his eyes locked on the men surrounding me. Without hesitation, he said, "What are you doing to my girlfriend?" His tone was sharp and commanding. The men glanced at each other, caught off guard by his presence. He reached out his hand toward me, never taking his eyes off them. "Come on, sweetheart," he said firmly. I didn't wait to question him. I grabbed his hand, holding onto it like it was my lifeline. He pulled me close to him, creating a barrier between me and the strangers. For a moment, everything was quiet, and I could feel the tension hanging in the air. As the men disappeared into the night, I felt a rush of relief mixed with overwhelming fear. My body began to shake, and tears streamed down my face. The stranger didn't say much. He just stood there holding my hand, letting me catch my breath. His calm presence was the only thing keeping me grounded at that moment. When I finally stopped trembling, he offered to walk me home. I didn't know who he was, but I trusted him completely after what had just happened. We walked slowly, and he kept talking, trying to distract me from the fear that still lingered. I nodded along, barely speaking, too shaken to process much of what he was saying. As we walked, I finally found the courage to ask him how he knew my name. He paused, then gave me a small smile and said, "I didn't, I just guessed." He explained that he'd been walking along the bridge when he noticed the group of men and the way they were surrounding me. Something about the situation didn't sit right with him, so he decided to step in. Calling out a name was his way of pretending he knew me and throwing them off. I couldn't believe his quick thinking. He told me he didn't know how things would play out, but felt he had to act. His calm demeanor and decisive action had likely saved me from something terrible. I thanked him over and over, but he just shrugged it off, saying anyone would have done the same. When we reached my home, I turned to thank him one last time. He smiled politely and declined my offer to come inside for something to drink. Instead, he said goodbye and walked away, leaving me standing at my door, still trying to process everything that had happened. I stepped inside, locked the door, and leaned against it, my legs feeling weak. I was safe, but the night had left a mark on me. I couldn't stop replaying the events in my mind, the fear, the helplessness, and then the relief of being saved by someone I didn't even know. That night, I lay awake for hours, thinking about how lucky I was. The kindness and courage of a complete stranger had turned what could have been a nightmare into a story of survival. I'll never forget that man, or the moment he stepped in when I needed help the most. Growing up, I moved a lot, but for a time, my family lived in one of the most dangerous neighborhoods in New York City. We were struggling financially, and life in the projects was hard. Our apartment was barely livable, cockroaches crawling everywhere, and just a couple of mattresses on the floor. It wasn't the kind of place where you felt safe, even inside your own home. Looking back, I realize how careless the adults in my life could be. It felt like no one was really watching out for me. Neglect was normal, and I ended up in situations no kid should ever face. Even the basics weren't guaranteed. The school bus I rode was an old van littered with beer bottles, driven by someone who didn't seem much better than the streets around us. Despite all of this, I found ways to keep myself entertained. I spent my days feeding pigeons from the balcony or putting on paper bag puppet shows for the other kids in the building. It was chaotic, but it was my version of normal. And that's how I ended up meeting a lot of parents in the building, including Emily's mom, the one who would ask me, a 9-year-old, to babysit her 5-year-old daughter. Transition to life in the projects wasn't easy. The building we lived in was old, dirty, and falling apart. It felt like danger was always nearby, whether it was the constant noise of arguments, fights outside, or the fear of someone breaking into your apartment. My parents were struggling to make ends meet, and there wasn't much they could do about it. We had what little we could afford, mattresses on the floor, and just enough to get by. I spent most of my time playing in the building with other kids. The stairwells and balconies were like our playgrounds because we didn't have anywhere else to go. Adults in the building often left their kids unsupervised, and looking back, I realized just how unsafe it all was. At the time, though, it was just the way life was. You learn it to adapt and take care of yourself, even as a child. It all started on a regular evening in the building. Emily's mom came to me with a request that didn't seem unusual at the time. She asked if I could watch her 5-year-old daughter for a few hours while she and her husband went out. I was only 9 years old, but to her, that didn't matter. Babysitting wasn't uncommon for kids my age in that neighborhood. Everyone just did what they had to do. My mom gave her permission right away, saying it would be fine since we lived on the bottom floor and Emily's family was just upstairs. My older brother, who was 14, was also at home, but he had no idea I'd agreed to this. It felt like an easy job. How hard could it be to watch a little girl for a few hours? But I had no idea what was about to happen. The knock at the door caught me off guard. I wasn't expecting anyone, but I didn't think much of it. I ran to the door, too short to see through the peephole, and opened it without hesitation. Standing there was a tall man, probably in his 40s, with a mustache and an easy smile. He seemed calm, almost too casual, as he introduced himself. He told me he was a friend of Emily's father, Sam, and that he had come by to see him. I explained that Sam wasn't home, thinking that would be the end of it. But instead of leaving, he stepped past me, walked right into the apartment, and made himself comfortable on the couch. I froze, unsure of what to do. He acted like he belonged there, like it was no big deal. At first, the man seemed harmless. He started chatting about random things, his favorite foods, his favorite colors, like he was just passing time. But the way he spoke felt too familiar, too comfortable for someone who didn't belong there. Emily sat nearby, quiet and still, which wasn't like her at all. I noticed she was trying to keep her distance, shifting away every time he got closer. Then, little by little, his behavior started to change. He reached out to touch Emily's shoulder, and I saw her flinch. She didn't say anything, but the look on her face told me she was scared. My gut was screaming that something wasn't right. The man's smile felt fake, his friendliness forced. I couldn't figure out what he wanted, but I knew I didn't trust him. The tension in the room was unbearable. Every time I moved, the man seemed to notice. If I got too close to the door or acted like I was about to leave, He casually blocked my path. It was subtle but deliberate, and it made my heart race. Emily, now visibly upset, stayed quiet and still, avoiding his gaze. I knew I had to think fast. That's when I remembered the phone I had seen earlier, hidden behind a plant. I needed an excuse to use it without making him suspicious. Trying to act natural, I suddenly blurted out, "Oh no, I forgot to feed my hamster." I didn't even have a hamster, but I made it sound urgent. "I just need to call my brother to feed her," I said, already walking toward the phone. I dialed as fast as I could, praying my brother would pick up. When he did, I spoke in code, trying to keep my voice calm. "I forgot to feed Skippy," I said, repeating it over and over. It didn't take long for him to realize something was wrong. "I'm coming," he said before hanging up. My heart raced as I waited, knowing help was on the way. The knock at the door was loud and firm, cutting through the tense silence in the room. The man froze, his casual demeanor slipping for just a moment. Before he could say anything, I sprinted to the door and swung it open. My brother stood there, calm but with a sharp look in his eyes. He didn't say much, just enough to make the situation feel normal to anyone watching. He stepped inside, leaving the door wide open, and glanced around. "Wow, it smells weird in here," he said, almost jokingly, as he grabbed a box to prop the door open. I realized what he was doing, keeping the door open for us to escape if things went wrong, and making enough noise to alert anyone nearby. The man tried to play along, introducing himself and pretending to know Emily's family, but his nervousness was starting to show. My brother didn't let him get comfortable. He kept the conversation short, his tone polite but firm. Finally, the man seemed to realize he was out of options. Without saying much, he got up, muttered something under his breath, and walked out the door. After the man left, the room felt eerily quiet. My brother shut the door but kept checking outside to make sure he didn't come back. Emily clung to me, tears in her eyes, too scared to say anything. I tried to comfort her, but my own hands were still shaking. We knew we had to call the police, so my brother wasted no time. When the officers arrived, they listened to what happened, but didn't seem too concerned. Since the man was gone, they said there wasn't much they could do. They took down some notes and left, leaving us feeling frustrated and still uneasy. When Emily's parents came home, we told them everything. They were horrified and couldn't believe someone had just walked into their home like that. Even though the immediate danger had passed, I couldn't stop thinking about what the man might have wanted. The thought of what could have happened if my brother hadn't arrived in time haunted me. That night stayed with me, long after it was over. I couldn't stop replaying everything in my mind: the man's calm entrance, his strange behavior, and how he managed to make himself seem like he belonged. What scared me the most was not knowing what he wanted. Was he there to hurt Emily? To rob the place? Or something worse? I'll never know. One thing was clear though. He knew there wouldn't be any adults home that night. That realization sent a chill through me. Had he been watching us? Waiting for the right moment? It was a question I couldn't answer, but it made me more cautious, more aware of how easily things could have gone wrong. I'm grateful my brother showed up when he did. His quick thinking and calmness saved us that night. But even now, when I think back to that evening, I feel the same rush of fear all over again. It's a memory I'll never forget, a reminder of how close danger can really be.